Before the passengers even felt the aircraft begin to accelerate, a situation had already developed that no one on board recognized until it was too late. In the darkness of a storm-battered airport, a Boeing 747 prepared to depart for Los Angeles from Taipei. The flight crew believed they were following a routine departure. Investigators would later discover that, despite an experienced crew, a strong safety culture, and an aircraft operating normally, the flight had lined up somewhere it was never meant to be. It was the evening of October 31, 2000. As Typhoon Zhangxing closed in on northern Taiwan, heavy rain swept across the airport, and powerful gusts rocked aircraft waiting on the ground. Even so, conditions remained just within the limits that allowed departures to continue. For the 159 passengers aboard Singapore Airlines Flight 6, it promised to be nothing more than the final stop before a long overnight journey across the Pacific, with most expecting to wake the following morning somewhere over the ocean. The Boeing 747 had arrived earlier from Singapore, where many of its passengers had already begun their trip. Others had boarded in Taipei, joining travelers from more than 20 countries. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was subdued. Rain streaked across the windows while the wind occasionally shook the aircraft, but this was the kind of weather many international travelers had experienced before. There was little reason to imagine that the flight would never leave the airport. Up front, the cockpit reflected the airline's reputation for disciplined operations. The captain, a veteran with more than 11,000 flight hours, was known for his calm judgment and methodical approach. Alongside him sat a first officer with less Boeing 747 experience, but a reputation for professionalism and clear communication. A relief first officer occupied the jump seat, monitoring the operation before taking over later in the flight. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate and began taxiing into the rain, the conversation remained deliberate and procedural. The weather was demanding, but it had not yet crossed the point where a departure would need to be delayed. If conditions deteriorated, they would simply return to the gate. There was no discussion of forcing the schedule or taking unnecessary risks. For everyone involved, the departure still appeared routine. The aircraft was operating normally. The crew had a clear clearance. The weather, although difficult, remained within limits. Yet at that moment, neither the pilots nor anyone else could know that the greatest threat that night would not come from the approaching typhoon. It was already waiting somewhere ahead, hidden within the airport itself. Taxiing across Taipei's airfield demanded far more attention than a normal departure. Sheets of rain blurred the windshield, wind gusts pushed against the aircraft's broad fuselage, and airport lights disappeared into the darkness beyond the narrow view ahead. The captain kept the Boeing 747 moving slowly, prioritizing control over speed. On a wet surface with strong crosswinds, saving a few seconds offered no advantage compared with maintaining a safe margin. While he focused on steering, the first officer continued preparing the aircraft for departure. Takeoff data was reviewed, aircraft configuration was confirmed, and the crew monitored the changing weather conditions. Behind them, the relief first officer followed the operation from the jump seat. At that stage, nothing suggested that the flight was heading toward danger. The weather remained challenging, but it was still within operating limits. The crew had already discussed what they would do if conditions deteriorated: stop the departure and return to the gate. There was no pressure to continue if the situation became unsafe. Air traffic control then issued taxi instructions toward runway 5 left. The captain repeated the route aloud while the other pilots followed along on their airport charts. In poor visibility, this shared understanding was an important safeguard. But there was one factor working against them. The crew had not operated from this runway configuration in several years. At the same time, Taipei's airport environment had been changing. Construction work had altered parts of the airfield, and some areas no longer matched the layout the pilots remembered. Under clear daylight conditions, these differences would have been easier to identify. In darkness and heavy rain, the airport presented a much more confusing picture. The aircraft continued along the assigned route, and the crew remained confident they understood exactly where they were. Then came a small piece of encouraging information. The reported runway visibility had improved slightly. It appeared that the weather was giving them a narrow opportunity to depart before conditions worsened. Everything seemed to be aligning. The aircraft was on schedule, the clearance was understood, the procedures had been followed. But beneath that sense of normality, the airport the crew expected to see, and the airport that actually existed around them were slowly becoming two different things. And neither the pilots nor the controller could yet recognize the difference. Approaching the end of the taxi route, the workload inside the cockpit increased again. Air traffic control cleared Singapore Airlines Flight 6 to line up for departure on runway 5 left. The first officer acknowledged the instruction, informed the cabin crew that the aircraft was preparing for takeoff, and returned to the final departure checks. Outside, however, the conditions continued to challenge the crew's ability to build a clear picture of their surroundings. The captain carefully guided the Boeing 747 forward, following the illuminated path ahead through the rain. His attention remained focused on maintaining the aircraft's position while managing the crosswind and slippery pavement. In the control tower, the controller monitored the aircraft through radio communication alone. Without surface movement radar, there was no independent way to confirm the aircraft's exact location once visibility became limited. Everything still appeared normal. The aircraft had received the correct clearance. The crew believed they were following the assigned taxi route. The lights ahead appeared consistent with what they expected to find. But the airport beneath them was no longer exactly the same environment they remembered. Runway 5 right had recently been closed for construction and was being converted into a taxiway. Although it was no longer available for departures, much of its previous runway environment remained in place. Markings, lighting, and the overall appearance of the surface still resembled an active runway. Under normal conditions, the difference would have been obvious. That night it was far less clear. As the Boeing continued forward, the crew received no warning that their position differed from what they believed. Their navigation systems were set for the intended departure runway, but those systems could only confirm the runway they expected to use, not necessarily the surface beneath the aircraft. Then one small detail caught their attention. A visual guidance system that should have helped confirm their position did not appear as expected. The first officer noticed the issue and mentioned it, but with the weather still appearing manageable and the aircraft already positioned for departure, the indication did not immediately trigger a complete reassessment. Later, investigators would identify this moment as one of the critical points in the sequence. The crew had noticed a clue, but because they already believed they were in the correct position, that clue did not carry the meaning it should have. This was confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret new information through the belief a person already holds about a situation. Ahead of the aircraft, hidden beyond the limits of the windshield and rain-covered darkness, the runway appeared ready for takeoff. But it was not the runway the crew thought they were on. The Boeing 747 was aligned with runway 5 right, the closed runway surrounded by construction equipment and concrete barriers. And in just moments, the aircraft would begin accelerating toward them. At 11:16 p.m., the final items on the before takeoff checklist were complete. Rain continued striking the windshield as the captain selected the highest setting on the wipers. The landing lights illuminated only a short distance ahead, creating a narrow path through the darkness. From the cockpit, the scene appeared exactly as expected for a difficult night departure. The aircraft was aligned. The clearance had been received. The runway ahead appeared open. There was nothing visible to suggest that anything was wrong. The thrust levers moved forward. 4 engines responded with a steady increase in power, and the Boeing 747 began accelerating into the storm. Inside the cabin, passengers felt the familiar force of takeoff as they were pushed back into their seats. For many of them, this was the moment the journey truly began, a routine departure before a long overnight flight across the Pacific. In the cockpit, the crew entered the familiar rhythm of takeoff. Engine instruments were monitored, airspeed calls were exchanged, and both pilots focused almost entirely on keeping the aircraft precisely aligned. But beyond the landing lights, the darkness concealed what was ahead. At 80 knots, the aircraft was already moving too quickly for the crew to easily reconsider the situation. The captain continued making small control inputs against the strong crosswind, unaware that the surface beneath the aircraft was not the runway he believed he had entered. Then through the rain, something appeared. At first, the objects ahead were only vague shapes in the darkness. They did not resemble runway lights or markings. They were irregular, stationary, and directly in the aircraft's path. As the distance closed, their identity became clear. Construction vehicles, heavy equipment, concrete barriers. The captain reacted immediately, but the Boeing was approaching 150 knots. There was no longer enough distance to stop, and no safe path around the obstacles. The aircraft struck the barriers with devastating force. The impact destroyed sections of the aircraft almost instantly. The underside of the Boeing was torn open as it collided with construction equipment scattered across the closed runway. Parts of the left wing separated, multiple engines broke away from their mounts, and fuel ignited as the aircraft continued sliding through the construction area. Within seconds, the quiet departure became a catastrophic accident. For those in the control tower, there was no warning transmission, no urgent call from the cockpit, and no indication of what had happened. The first unmistakable sign was a fireball cutting through the rain-filled night. In the hours after the accident, investigators faced a question that seemed almost impossible to answer. How had an experienced flight crew, operating a fully functional aircraft, attempted a takeoff from a runway that was closed for construction? The aircraft had been maintained correctly. The engines had produced normal takeoff power. The crew had followed the required procedures. Yet somehow, a Boeing 747 carrying 179 people had accelerated into darkness toward obstacles that should never have been in its path. The answer was not found in one careless decision. It was found in a chain of small, understandable factors that aligned at exactly the wrong moment. Emergency crews reached the aircraft within minutes of the impact. Despite the severe weather, firefighters and rescue teams fought through the rain to reach the wreckage, but they found an aircraft that had already been devastated by the collision and fire. The Boeing 747 had broken into multiple sections, with debris scattered throughout the construction area. Of the 179 people on board, 83 lost their lives. The remaining passengers and crew survived with varying degrees of injury, including all 3 pilots. For Singapore Airlines, the accident represented the first fatal crash in the company's history, a devastating event for an airline known worldwide for its safety standards. As investigators reconstructed the final moments of the flight, they discovered that the accident was not caused by one failure. Instead, several factors had combined. Heavy rain and darkness reduced the crew's ability to visually confirm their exact position. The closed runway still contained markings, lighting, and features that made it appear similar to an active runway. Construction had altered the airport environment, while incomplete lighting and temporary changes created additional confusion. At the same time, Air traffic control had no surface movement radar capable of independently confirming the aircraft's location, once visibility became limited. Inside the cockpit, the crew had encountered clues that something was unusual. The expected runway guidance did not appear as anticipated, but because the aircraft still seemed consistent with their understanding of the taxi route, those signs were interpreted as minor irregularities rather than evidence of a larger problem. Investigators identified this as confirmation bias. It was not a sign of poor judgment or a lack of professionalism. It was a normal human limitation. Once people believe they understand a situation, conflicting information can become easier to dismiss. The accident led to major changes throughout aviation. Airports strengthened procedures for temporary runway closures, construction zones, and lighting systems. Airlines placed greater emphasis on threat and error management, encouraging crews to actively question assumptions before they became dangerous. Modern aircraft increasingly incorporated advanced airport moving maps and ground position awareness systems to help crews identify their exact location in poor visibility. The loss of Singapore Airlines Flight 6 remains one of aviation's clearest reminders that accidents rarely happen because of one impossible mistake. More often, they occur when ordinary decisions, normal human limitations, and small environmental changes combine in a way that no one recognizes in time. The pilots that night were not reckless. They were professionals operating in difficult conditions, relying on information that appeared reliable. But the airport they believed they were departing from was not the airport that actually existed around them. Years later, the runway where Flight 6 began its final takeoff remains a reminder of one of aviation's hardest lessons. Safety depends not only on preventing mistakes, but on understanding how reasonable people can make them. From that tragedy came changes that continue to protect crews and passengers around the world, not because aviation became immune to human error, but because it learned how to recognize it before another routine departure becomes something else entirely.